Welcome everyone to Fontribute, where we talk about fonts and their attributes. Fontribute. It's me, Thomas. I'm just running solo today, so this should be a kind of quick run of an episode this week. So let's get started. So we're exploring monospace fonts, and recently Array Mono from JTD Fonts came out, and I was very interested in the project. I remember seeing the specimen PDF of it. And as a monospace typeface, I was really intrigued by the approaches James Todd used to design it. So I reached out to him, asking if I could check this out for a contribute. He was happy to oblige. So thank you, James, for that. And I figured this is a great opportunity to explore some of the innovations that are possible within monospace fonts. And I'm going to use Vulf Mono from OHno Type as a comparison of the different approaches. I think in particular, you'll notice how I think we have, at least I did in the past, have a very kind of particular assumption about what monospace are in terms of how they should look because of the properties of monospace fonts. And I really appreciate about Array, just an initial run of it. And now what I'm going to do exploring it is how you could take a genre that seems very typical or has a lot of conventions you would normally expect and play off it by interjecting different principles or different ideas on top of the monospace project's kind of requirements built into it. So the main property of a monospace font, for those who don't know, is all the glyphs fit exactly the same space. So what ends up happening is a kind of characteristic property about it is letters as wide as an M, for example, are given exactly the same spacing as an I, right? And this is a pretty universal principle of monospace fonts. So this leads to I think a lot of designers really appreciate monospace fonts because it gives a very particular texture that is not conventional, because normally the M would be much wider than the I, for example. And the craft of type design dealing with monospace fonts is how to compensate for this regularity of spacing, even though the forms don't necessarily demand or won't allow it as easily. Some letters tend to want to be narrower than others, so this is all forced and they all fit exactly the same set width. So let's get started by investigating how this is applied across Array Mono and Vulf Mono in this case. So the first thing we'll notice is, well, there's a lot of things basically. We're ready to get started. So I think the first thing is just on the comparison of the two. We'll start with the serifs. That's a pretty good place to start. So Vulf Mono, actually in both of them, let's point this out. They're generally low contrast, right? The differences between thicks and thins and most areas are pretty consistent across each other. There is obviously a main area of discussion we need to talk about, which is the joints branching system, right? This is probably one of the main differences of the two you'll notice. First off, first thing you'll notice is the much higher branching position of Array versus the much deeper branching in Vulf Mono. So that's the first thing you'll notice. And that actually has the property of the inner counter being very different between the two. All right, notice there's more kind of abrupt movement in Array Mono versus this more smooth and kind of pushing over to the right side of Vulf Mono. There's also along this way some other differences. So we'll start with the serifs to talk about that. So notice in Vulf Mono, there's this very long bracketing, and in fact, actually flaring out. There's actually kind of a flare out that's occurring and cupping on the sides of Vulf Mono, right? And I believe, yes, also on the baseline area of the serifs as well. Let's contrast that to Array Mono, which we see we see a much more abrupt movement of the serif to stem relationships. There is some puffing on the outside. If you see that again, you see some puffing on the serifs, as well as on the bottom over here. So what tends to be happening here is that both of them are trying to solve the problem of how to make these serifs not so sterile or so kind of flat noted by just being perfect rectangles. There's a lot of nuance in those decisions. Probably part of the reason why this intuition, how I think about it, is it's just to make it not boring, quite frankly, right? Compared to, because it's relatively low contrast. There is some movement of contrast in the joints, where it looks like Vulf Mono is a little more so. But it tends to be how to infuse some character into
these kind of base forms that are straightforward. There's also some fun moves in terms of what we can see is some appears to be some kind of flaring out in this one area of Vulf mono, and I believe looks like a little bit also over here as well. Basically, it's not perfectly rectilinear, right? They're not the perfect rectangles going straight down on that side of the stem. And actually, we can see a fun move in array mono, the kind of cutting in right here. That's asymmetric to what's going on top here. So it literally cuts into this space more than what this top area would expect. It was really a very fascinating move. We actually see also, again, notice the thickness over here versus the thickness over here that is actually tapering as it comes to the head serif, the flag serif over here, which both have similar, well, they're both going in one direction, but again, they're mirroring what's going on in their foot serifs. Take notice of that. There is a distinction that this one has more of an angle, right, versus a horizontal flat, which makes sense considering what's called the kind of old style Renaissance referencing that array is pulling from, while Vulf mono is calling much more of a slab serif tradition. You know, it's the 1800s, early 19th century flarings of it. There's also some fun moves in terms of the positioning, so of how the serifs are going to be handled. So notice in Vulf mono, there's a kind of directional serif on the right side versus a bilateral bidirection, basically a foot serif that goes in both directions versus a directional serif on the right side. Contrast that to array mono. It does maintain serifs on both sides of the stem. However, this is longer on the outside versus the inside, right? The inside is much shorter than the outside. There appears to be probably, I would imagine, some reasons of economizing of space because of your set widths being so consistent across the font. We'll explore this in the other letters as we move forward. But I guess the main thing I would say just kind of what caught my attention when I saw array mono, which we're demonstrating here, is these really interesting movements of either cutting into or moving weight in ways I wouldn't expect. I think it might be part of the strategy of how to solve this kind of low contrast model with these serifs kind of being of a very close equivalence to the stems. I find that a very interesting strategy in terms of how to make this work in a text setting or in a kind of have a typographic color compensate for these challenges of monospace and low contrast. Let alone this introduction of this old style movement of the high branching, right, versus the low branching, and actually how the weight is distributed, right? Kind of notice how the movement of the shoulder is handled between the two. Let's take this information in hand as we move forward to the other letters. All right, so the O. So this is really, you know, we could start sensing some differences at the end. The O, we could really now start seeing some differences. The main note is this counter, right? Notice how the counter has this kind of, football effect, this kind of really strong pinching on the upper left and bottom right quadrants of array mono versus this, kind of really symmetrical, smoothed out feeling, and a Vulf mono instead. So that's a very clear difference between the two. Vulf mono really maintains the low contrast model across this whole system. There is a difference between the horizontal and vertical elements here, but it's relatively minor. Let's contrast that to array mono and the nature of how this outer curve and this inner counter was drawn. It causes this reduction of weight in this segments right here and right here. This creates basically a kind of stress, right? Even though the base form is low contrast, right? Especially in this iris right here. Actually, it's interesting because before, in the end example, if I just go back to that as an example, I was getting a little suspicious that I thought that Vulf mono was going to have higher contrast because of how this joint was handled, right, compared to the array mono. But then when we switch over to the O's, we've actually inverted the setups. So this is actually kind of important understanding. There's a more advanced typeface design because normally we would say everything should be treated the same. So if you're high contrast in one area, your other letters should mirror that as well. This is an example of variation of that. Part of that is the tradition of a kind of slab serif approach or kind of sans serif principle or thinking. where the roundness of an O does not need to mirror really the joint system of the N, but rather the shoulder and stem and serif relationships instead, as we can see here and here. Meanwhile, with array, there seems to be a little more closer trying to find association of these weights, right, in the thin parts of the O to what we had in the N of array. So already we're seeing some very interesting different strategies in how weight and contrast was being handled between the two. It should be noted how radically wider this O is. It's just like woof. It's kind of a if I drew this as a rectangle, you could kind of feel like the rectangle is longer than taller. While here, there is a difference, but this is much more of a squarish shape, right, compared to the Vulf mono approach. So that's actually already, again, very interesting. Let's see how this plays out in typographic color and pacing when we see the setting in text. I'm looking forward to seeing seeing the effects of all these properties we're seeing so far. All right, so now we come to the round and straight combined. So let's investigate what comes out of this. So already the first thing we could see, we've now entered almost entrap properties at this point. The end, remember, if we go back to the end, right? Remember we had this little this tapering right here, right, from the stem going into the joint and the flag serif. Notice when we switch back to the D, this property is now changed into something very different. Now it's literally a kind of puffing, effectively a kind of entrap effect of a puffing out of this segment right here, but then a reduction as it moves towards the kind of intersection areas of the flag serif on top here and the bold joint relationship right here. This is mirroring, again, a pen stroke contrast we saw in the O, right? Remember, see that football joint system right there, the thickening right here, the thinning at this quadrant, the thickening over here, and thinning at this quadrant. Let's contrast that to Vulf mono, where notice that both areas of the joint to the bowl area, the bowl and the stem, as they join together at that joint, basically where the bowl and the stem come together, notice that there's equivalent, not necessarily exactly equivalent, but there is both a reduction in weight on the top and bottom ones versus an addition and subtraction in array mono. I say that because in Vulf, you can actually see there's slightly more weight right here than in this quadrant right here. So that actually, if you notice, while this is a kind of historical expansion or moving forward from the Renaissance calligraphic thinking that array mono would talk about, there seems to be some bias assumption where we should have more weight up here than down here. So I find that very interesting just to see that point. We can see that the left side of the counter appears to mirror some properties of the O in both cases, right? Basically, you see the joint system here, and this kind of rectangular, super squirtle kind of squircle effect in array mono, while the right side seems to be, again, a new vocabulary idea described, right? So notice this kind of flatness of this intersection in the counter segment versus this kind of triangularization area right there, but it's really rounded. They kind of mirror the kind of roundness effect, but we should notice that too. So this is kind of a continuous rounded effect versus the abrupt approach right here on the right side of the counter for these Ds. There's also some fun strategies, by the way, done in Vulf mono. So we should see there's actually kind of a flaring out right here versus the primary stem, which is really interesting. This might be a result of actually a reduction right here. So actually, yeah, it appears that there's a reduction at the joint area of the stem, which is reintroduced as it gets up to the flag serif, which is actually following at least some idea of compensation for joints to the flag serif thinking in array. That's really fascinating. Also, it appears that it looks like both these flag serifs appears to be longer than the N example, remember correctly. Yes. So if I look at the flag serifs in both ends, right, it brings back over to the Ds, I can see that these flag serifs are much longer. It makes perfect sense in it when we think about it as taking up more, kind of occupying this space. If these were the exact length as the flag serifs at the N position, at the baseline level, it would probably feel unstable and not fill the space very adequately. Bleh, excuse me. So those are points to take notice. Also take notice of the kind of flatness of the foot serif in this, or angle serif. Excuse me, this is an angle serif because of where it's positioned. But I meant to say this angle serif is mirroring much closer the foot serif at the end, which again aligns with our understanding of Vulf mono as a slab serif, because as slab serifs go, they simplify their structures to move forward, to become more harmonious with each other, right? So here's an example normally we would expect for slab serif principles, right, versus old styles, right, where there's a lot more variation. So for example, right, so here's an example, right, versus the D example on these two, is we'll have an angled approach, which would have some relationship to the angle approach of the N. And we're seeing that here, right, in these two comparisons of these. Well, so while mirroring very similar principles, right? Notice the kind of cupping in these all quadrants, right? And this route and kind of different radius transition right here versus the abrupt movement here, and the again puffing kind of puffiness we're seeing in the terminals of array mono. I'm almost tempted actually with array mono to talk about it. It's almost like this is puffing out and then cuts in even like really abruptly right here. It's really interesting, right? Versus this one seems to be kind of flaring out. So these seem to be kind of puffing on an outward position, while these seem to be kind of coming inward and then moving out. So even their kind of flaring properties are different between the two. So let's see how this plays out as we move forward. Okay, so now what we got from the control letters onto some variant letters, some special characters to get to see really how the flavor plays out. And we can really see it here. One is how the terminals are handled on these A's, right? Notice that array mono does not have a bold terminal, while Vulf mono does, which makes sense. This is a slab serif tradition, so we normally would see bold terminals in this approach between the two. The tail or angle serifs in these positions are mirroring what we saw in the D. How the bowls are handled in both of these, while proportionally are very different, right? They don't. You can actually see really in an array, excuse me, Vulf mono, like this does not occupy the same kind of intensity of roundness as the D did, probably because they had to compensate, right, for this bowl terminal taking the primary performance of the shape versus the bowl in the D example, right? So notice how much weight this had relative to this. Notice in the A, that's been removed. So the primary emphasis has been placed here and here, with a reduction over here in this segment to compensate for this bowl terminal being introduced. So again, notice how Vulf mono is really playing with the contrast structures of the forms to try to achieve, I'd assume, an even typographic color, even though there's a lot of interjections of contrast at different intensities and different positions. Meanwhile, array mono doesn't have to worry about that as much because of the lack of a bold terminal, yet we still do see a reduction in the weight over here versus this primary stroke over here. There's also some really fun moves happening. There appears to be a tapering effect right here versus up here. And looks to be a little curvature cut in right there. Yeah, there's a lot of crinkling. It's almost like a piece of paper was crinkled at the joints of arrays letters, and it's causing a lot of fun texture play so far just in the individual letters. And again, notice the kind of how the slope is handled. It kind of gives a feeling similar to how the branching we relate in the end, right? Notice the kind of high branching leads to a relatively high positioned A, right? Versus array Vulf mono. It does tip down, but it's not as extreme in this top segment of the A. That's left to the joint area right here to cut in very deeply. And actually, you can start seeing now the system and why it makes sense to do so. This allows for opportunity for more time. Gives the designer time to spill out this position right here. So James was very actually both of them are James, by the way. They're in naming. So OHno types James actually was very wise to cause this high branching right here to give himself time with this kind of flaring out in the angle serif. Now notice that actually this appears to be a cut-in right here on the stem, right, in the cut-in versus the serif over here. So again, compensation strategies are being taken in the serif position of the A, right? So notice again, all these different strategies are being attempted to produce an even color in the typographic representation of this A. All right, so let's move on to the next one to see how that's going. We get to the G. So this is a very complicated form. And there's probably a lot of compensation strategies to compensate for that. So the first thing is, we'll start with the Vulf mono one right here. Take notice, again, the kind of very heavy weight and movements right here and here. Notice the main reduction here, a secondary reduction here, which is interesting because normally we'd expect traditionally the main spine of the G is the predominantly heavyweight segment of it, mainly from calligraphic pen principles. But as you notice there, you can extrapolate and manipulate that principle to get the the typographic color you're aiming for, which array mono actually maintains as well. Notice that the predominant weight is this segment right here. There's actually a reduction right in this segment right here. It's taking a longer period of time. Like notice this, how it's handled versus, if I clear out my markings, you can see. If you notice how these approaches are handled, you should see a significant difference of the two. Predominantly, it basically has a reduction of weight here that's actually gaining weight over here versus over here. There's a relatively consistent movement as it gets to the horizontal, the kind of vertical weight area between the two, right here and here. So there's again, as I said before, there's a lot of like movement, pushing around, a lot of finagling in array mono to kind of get this weight to manage properly while imposing calligraphic stress. And even doing different strategies of ink trapping. If you notice, there's all these rectilinears that weren't so obvious in other letters. In this letter, they're made very apparent, which do exist even in Vulf mono. They're much minor, but they're still there. Right, and all these little approaches right here. So these are attempts to create a little rectilinear shape, like so, to help impose more white space in these areas where weight would normally gain. Notice again in the O, the kind of football effect in this counter versus this more squished oval effect. And Vulf mono has been maintained from the O into the G. There's a fun move where I'm actually a little suspicious that this area might be less than the other one. I'm actually going to investigate that. I'm going to measure that. Let's see. They're very, very close. Very closely handled. Slightly more. Maybe a little bit more on the top than the bottom. James Edmondson would have to give me a verification if that was the case or not. It's definitely the case that there's a reduction right in this segment right here, right, to compensate for this neck or position over here, which is a similar, again, strategy done here, right, to compensate for this. It is fun also to note, kind of notice this smooth transition, right? You can kind of cups right over. So again, very much the slap serif tradition, right, versus this more abrupt neck position movement. And this neck having to compensate with this kind of emphasis weight on the side over here versus horizontal in Vulf mono. So again, we're seeing this contrast structure and stress positions being imposed. It would not be nice for me not to talk about the ear positions. Take notice of this really fun move of kind of this kick up, right? And the kind of while roundingness is all occurring. So it's kind of attempting a bowl terminal as much as possible in this one segment right here, while Vulf mono chose to omit it and create this really thinned out little triangular, or not right triangle, rectilinear. Yeah, it is triangular. Excuse me, a triangular shape ear in Vulf mono. So contrast to the A. So again, normally actually we would expect, for example, remember for array, it has a terminalless lack of a bold terminal shape in the A, while Vulf mono does have a bold terminal. So notice again, this really, kind of more advanced typeface design, you'll make exceptions, and you may choose in this letter form go for the terminal, the bold terminal, and the other one not, for different strategies, versus doing it all the same in all cases. So this is again, something we'll look for and observe in the text settings to see if this was a wise move to be done. The last note is you actually notice that it looks like proportionally they're relatively similar, I would say, in their proportions of the kind of in the vertical positioning of proportions of the neck to the loop to the bowl area, right? So these positions all seem to be in relationship to each other. Yeah, the main note you should take is that generally this space, and let's actually just investigate that, if they are equivalent. Yeah, so in this case, notice that the top bowl in Vulf Mono was larger than the bottom loop area. However, both of those are significantly larger than the neck connection, right? The connector of these two areas. Let's investigate if that's the case for array mono. So I'll draw that. Yes, so it's true in both of them. So notice that there's a kind of hierarchy of proportions, right? So notice that the top bowl gets the predominant spacing, the loop gets the second position, the second emphasis of spacing, and the neck kind of just fills in the space between the two, right? From the X height position to the decenter position. So that's an interesting principle to take note across all the forms. It's actually kind of cool, by the way, with Vulf Mono, because generally we were saying that there seemed to be no stress, yet the way this is positioned and the way the cutting of the weight has occurred, I'm actually sensing a very interesting kind of push up here and a downward push over here. So kind of a push up and a push down. That's really interesting. So that's, even though this form you would generally not say it would have stress, there are slight movements or attempts to try to show an emphasis of weight in certain areas, right, and a reduction in other areas. This is it's made very clear in array mono, but much more subtly the case in Vulf Mono, but it is still there, very subtly so. Makes it very interesting as a form. Okay, so we're on to the S. So both chose to add terminals to it. We see that commonality of the two, right? It's the circular shape versus the rectilinear shape between the two. The kind of abrupt cutting motions in the inner counters is contrast to the smooth transitions in the spine. There appears to be some higher emphasis on the spine area of weight in array mono. So if I measure that space, for example, let's contrast that to the kind of top terminal, the top area and the bottom area of the S. We can see that those are less, those have been reduced, which makes sense because they need to compensate for the terminal at the end. Let's investigate if that was done also for the S. I have a sinking suspicion that's not the case. I think they might be equivalent. Oh, I was stand corrected. It was slightly done on the top. Let's find out if that was done on the bottom. Was, but very, slightly so, but yes. So good. So basically they're all following the principle. Obviously array mono is doing it more so, right? A more higher variance, while Vulf Mono is much less the case. They're both taking a very wide amount of space. This is a very wide S. You should probably notice in general, up to this point, most of the letter forms really didn't seem to violate their natural proportions that much. S's, we're starting to see it. These are pretty wide S's for these forms. And the reason why is because, if you should have been noticing, I didn't really talk about it because all these other ones seem to hit their spaces relatively naturally. They are occupying the same white box, that set width, right? That bounding box position is the same. This is the first letter we're starting to see now some manipulation of the main letter form to compensate for this fact that they're in the same space. However, while that's the case, they are applying some basic principles of typeface design in their thinking. So for example, if you notice, the bottom part of the S is wider than the top part of the S right here. So the contrast of this sharpness in the inside versus the smoothness on the outside produces the contrast in this form on the bottom terminal.
Meanwhile, on top, there's this actually, again, notice it's kind of this curvature right here, and then it's something else happening right here, and it kind of cuts in right here. So there's, like I said, there's actually like a movement right here and right here. So even at that kind of joint area, that joining of the flag serif with the main stem, there's this kind of kinetic crunching or energy happening on that kind of position right here. It's really interesting. Again, this is part of the reason why this project caught my attention when I saw it released. And again, we could see and notice it's an angled approach versus a strong horizontal approach in Vulf mono. And there's again this kind of puffing out of the form while some tapering is occurring here versus this part right here. So again, it's a lot of energy, a lot of things are going on in the array mono typeface. Contrasting that to Vulf mono, again, things are happening, but a little more stabilized, I would say. Right. So notice the nature of the contrast positions. There's not these radical movements of change of weight as we saw in array mono. It does have this hyper expanded flag serif, right? But it's maintaining and it's adding some flavor to it by this kind of cupping effect on the quadrants. Some more than others. Look, there's a little more up here than actually down here. There's a little bit down the bottom, but not as much. There's kind of the curve radius here, which is much tighter than this curve radius, which then leads into the bowl terminal we saw in the A. Lastly, I always found interesting is the position of the tittle. It should be roughly the middle, right, of the energy of the stroke, right? So like right here, which it appears it does so. It appears it's the case. I always have the feeling, I always look at these letters, and I always feel like those tittles are like tipped off to the right a little bit, partly for spacing purposes. Yeah, there's something about these energies that kind of make me feel like they're moving more towards the right than the left. It's very subtle, but it's slightly there. Part of my intuition is that's the case is partly because they're watching for, right, this space, right? These are the spaces they're watching for because they have to deal with that compared to see the tightness, especially in Vulf mono, but in array mono as well. They're trying to compensate for. So I think partly part of the instincts of shifting over the eye is to help balance that spacing decision as well. Okay, now it would be remiss of me not to deal with the M, the most characteristic form we're going to that you can identify really quickly as a monospace is like the IJ and the M. Those are really strong ones to pick out. So contrasting to the N. Remember, I'll just draw them over here for remembrance. Remember that for array mono, it was basically foot serifs that are bidirectional in both cases, while Vulf mono did have a bidirectional in the first stem, but on the second one it was a directional. Now, what's occurred here is we've gone to directional in Vulf mono in both cases, and no serifs at all in the middle, which is mirrored by array. Right, but in this case, he knows that both gone. And notice it's not the traditional method in calligraphic thinking where if you do a directional, generally they go like this. There's a kind of left to the right mode that's occurred, partly from calligraphic drawing principles, or writing principles, excuse me. In this case, that's been manipulated to say, that's cool, we can do directional, but we're gonna make sure there's all this white space in the inside, because that's the main priority to compensate for it, is we have to get this white space as much as possible, which means in this case, the serifs got to get cut in, removed completely, in Vulf mono. Array does do the approach of removing serifs completely in the middle to solve that problem, but it does try to maintain inner serifs, right, to maintain the system. I believe it looks. Let's do the measurements to verify. I believe there is shorter on the inside versus the outside, but I might be wrong because of the economy issues, and I was wrong. Yes. So what's going on? Because again, it's all dealing with the same space, and this. See what's happening here? Like the M has to hit. It's almost hitting the side bearing because it's trying to maximize the space as much as humanly possible. There's a lot of interventions and changes to the serif lengths to compensate for that.
especially in an array model, we can see that because of the choice to keep the inner serifs as well. However, some things are made consistent. Right, notice the kind of tapering at the joint system up here in the flex serif. Right, the nature of the high branching has been maintained. Right, in array mono, the branching is lower in Vulf mono, but I believe it's probably may not be equivalent to the n. I would need to compare the two to verify that. But we can see those two strategies occurring. The program also of this kind of flaring out system in Vulf mono has been mirrored by the puffing out system of array mono. So again, notice the kind of, if you make a summary of Vulf mono, it's kind of this flaring out mode, while array mono is kind of puffing out mode of dealing with strokes and terminals across the two. I do believe generally the stems in these forms will be reduced in weight to try to compensate for typographic color. I'll need to verify that. So let's do a side note. Let's do a little test. Maybe I can copy you. Let's see if I can hop over the N to verify that. Yes, it is the case. Yeah, so there's been a reduction. Thank you guys for entertaining me while I tested that out. It's a very slight reduction, but a reduction of weight is attempted to try to get the weight to work in such a tight space. Because as you cram, if you cram the same stem weights inside this in the same box, but with reduced counters, reduced negative white space, you're going to result in a heavier letter. That's the end property. So what ends up happening is if you're doing monospace fonts, you need to reduce the weight in the M or these congested letters to try to compensate for these properties. So take note of that. Meanwhile, other properties have been maintained, right? So again, the flag serifs are being maintained in their identity across the two. So we can see again the system is being applied with modifications as necessary to make this work in this incredibly challenging space of the M. I also add the W because I thought also again it's one of those severely compromised letters that you're going to have to make severe interventions to solve. The predominant way this was done in Vulf mono was a reduction of weight on the inner counter versus the inner strokes, inner movements to the apex area versus the outer. Notice that this one was given more weight than this one, right? And I believe if I do the measurements of weight, it is less. Yes, it is less than the outer ones. Whoops, that's not what I wanted. So that gives you an idea. Weight difference between the two. With the predominant movement of the serifs, it's kind of the serifs are primary, these are secondary, this is third, and this is fourth. And that was the order decision made. Meanwhile, with array mono, I mean there's a lot going on here, but the first note is it appears that this was maintaining calligraphic energy by these two being the primary weight distributions. This is third, and this was fourth. So take note of that difference of weight distribution decisions. Both are valid for the historical models we're basing them on, but take note of that. There's a lot of other decisions too. One is, notice again the primacy of the serifs, right? One is the length, right? Notice how much shorter these are on the outside versus the inside, partly because again how close it has. They're trying to maximize the edge as much as possible for the side bearings they're dealing with that are fixed. Notice the incredible length of the inside serifs. Take note of that. And notice the program we've seen before. In this case of array mono, there's a lot of extreme interventions of like puffing out, ink trap, more sloping, and then real puffing out over here. Again, ink trap. So this method of puff out and ink trap, it appears to be the strategy being applied to array mono. Versus the kind of flaring out method and ink trap, basically not done on these serif positions, but is done on these vertex and apex positions. I take note of that, and the very strong rectilinear position of how the joints and how the diagonals are joining at the vertex areas. Notice again, they're not like this, right? They're not sharp points. They're like these rectilinear shapes that try to fill out this space as much as possible. and buy time for this apex position. It is worth noting that both of them did the strategy of basically a suppressed apex, right? Instead of the, say serif, apex, serif position, kind of give an equivalency to the serifs. It's in this case been moved down below, partly because, well, quite frankly, if they're put all at the top, it causes some weird problems. These have to slope up. These have to angle up way more aggressively. They have to fight with the serif positions. It gets quite messy. So I think so both of them shows as a wise decision to drop the apex of the W to try to compensate for all these weight challenges they're having to compensate for. It is also very challenging, also W's, because there's like it's hard to describe this. It's basically there's a lot of energy happening, right? So you have like this movement of these two, and you got these movements of these two. So what's happening, you have these forces that are moving the letter this way, and then you have the counter movements this way. I've always personally struggled with W's because I felt like finding that harmonious balance of these opposing energies, one going diagonally one way versus the other, is very challenging to create a stable form that has it. A typical problem a lot of students learn type-based design deal with, or people doing type-based design, is creating stability of the form when you're dealing with these opposing forces of diagonals to the right to the left, and then from the left to the right as well. What tends to happen a lot is that forms tend to feel kind of moving more towards, say, this area versus this area. And a really effective form tends to try to counterbalance those as much as possible between the two. Right? It doesn't really help, by the way, that this has this bowing effect here, that this one is actually doing the opposite, seems to be bowing like this way. So it almost seems like this was intentionally done to place a overemphasis in this quadrant and a minimization over here. So I'm going to watch for that in the type setting. While Vulf Mono seems to, if I'm looking at it, it appears much more, it seems more balanced. It seems a little more intentionally in the trying to find harmonization of the balances, slightly push oriented to the right, to the left side, excuse me, a little bit more, but not as extreme as a feeling of energy of that compared to array mono. So let's observe that when you see the type settings with it. All right, so we've gone through the individual letters. I wonder sometimes if me going alone is actually better or worse than going with a partner or a co-host with me, because I just get into the nitty-gritty with it. Okay, we'll find out the recording how this plays out. Okay, so now we got the comparison of the capitals to the lowercase and their ascenders to the x-height relationships. What we'll notice is that Vulf Mono it's a much wider form in the capital versus the array mono approach. Both of them are introducing a higher ascender versus the cap height. We can see that relationship. Yes, and again, it's always challenging because remember the capitals have to play by exactly the same rules as the lowercase. So as a result, a big challenge is making sure your capitals feel harmonious and take up enough space and justification with the uppercase, especially when normally, and you can definitely see this is the case, we use these very, very large x heights. These x heights are really, really large compared to the cap height and the ascender. Probably, I suspect part of the reason why these ascenders are told in the cap height is to deal with this issue of incredibly large x heights. As a result, the ascenders are going to need to be puffed up a little bit higher than the cap heights to get this to work as letter forms and to be readable. So those are important notes to observe. And by the way, we saw the grammar we understood from the lowercase applied in the uppercase with some interesting newer properties. So for example, this is actually kind of a flatness right here versus a tapering in. Take note of that. And there appears to be kind of a bowing on the bottom versus the more flatness on the top on array mono versus, a general tightness on these segments, but the serifs do have a round radius similar in property to the lowercase. The main thing I'll be watching for in the uppercase to lowercase relationships is how they harmonize with each other, considering these limitations and challenges that they have.
So I did some also explorations of the accents in this case. So in general, what you'll see is, again, array mono kind of, because it has this idea of kind of, I call it kind of puffiness. There's actually kind of a casual feeling in the accents because there's actually been a kind of exaggeration of this puffiness effect in the acute, grave, circumflex, and also things like the kind of introduction of kind of abrupt contrast in the tilde introduced in array. And we can see kind of a very strong distance between in the direst positions of array. Meanwhile, in Vulf mono, again, we see we should be seeing as the kind of the ingredients from the letter forms are being applied, extrapolated into the accent characters. So notice there's actually slight flaring in a similar nature in these accents as they were in the main letter forms. Some cases actually really strong. This is actually incredibly, I'm a little surprised how strong this one is compared to a more sober approach in the acute and grave for Vulf mono. And notice the angled approach in the terminals of array versus the verticalness of Vulf. This is mirroring what we saw in other forms, or the ideas from the other letter forms we saw in the project. And notice the closeness of the direst is over here versus the farness in this one over here. Because they're monospace, everything took exactly the same space, so I couldn't fit the punctuation forms in the same slide as the accent characters. So that's why we have a new slide here, a separate slide for punctuation. Yeah, take notice that again the bold terminals are being applied to the quotation marks, commas. Notice the difference in profile of these two based on the ingredients we saw in the other projects. Notice the punctuation is incredibly large. Generally, especially beginner typeface designers or people learning typeface design will usually make their punctuations like this very small, like not aggressive enough. These are not having that problem. They are taking a very strong parameter of space to achieve their effect. So that's you're not going to miss these punctuations. That's very clear, very much so. What's fun with Vulf mono is this really strong approach where there's actually a very strong weight right here and in the ball terminal and just a reduction here. Notice versus the primariness of this area right here, and this is the secondary element here. So notice the positions of weight and where reduction occurs is different between the two. And like I said about the J, we can see on the I as well. Take notice it's incredibly long serifs in the I. Compared to the H, you'll see a dramatic difference in their lengths. All right, and same goes for the flag serif positions over here. So things we set up for the J applies to the I as well. And notice on punctuation, again, everything's taking the same amount of space, so they're going to have to work with it. One thing is, again, there's kind of really strong punctuation symbols of the period, right? It makes it really punchy. Boom, it's really there, right? The bold terminal here, is mirroring what's going on over there, while the other elements are given much more diminished emphasis, we can see in these forms. Array, it is still the case, right? This is not considered the same equivalent weight as this, right? And likewise over here to here. So that might be a property of monospace to kind of de-emphasize a lot of the elements of the punctuation of the secondary parts of exclamation and exclaim to compensate for the weight. Although I'm not necessarily fully sold on that. I hopefully put these in text settings to check that, to verify that. But that's what I can definitely see for both of these so far in common. Also notice again the kind of shallow sloping of this question mark versus this more deeper sloping and smoothness bending around of the question mark mirroring we saw in the A, for example, right, versus this A. So take note of that. And numbers. So these are all monospace. So I'm pretty confident array mono does have old style figures. I just figured I don't think Vulf mono did, so I just chose not to include that. But we should generally notice that the numbers are following principles we saw in other letter forms, right? So notice the lack of bold terminals versus the inclusion of bold terminals. as such, right, versus these examples. There is a fun move. Well, so it was actually a fun move, by the way, in Vulf Mono. Notice there is a bullet terminal. There's one, but notice this serif introduction right here. Very interesting. It's again a fun move where there's a I think a very smart interjection of another ingredient that, while is very valid, but maintains the system, right? While array mono again follows the same system, no bullet terminals at all in these approaches. There's a fun move being decided in the for. So example, in Vulf, the serifs were included, and that meant basically this for had to compensate. This top segment had to deal with that, while array chose not to, and chose to kind of let this top part really dominate a lot of the territory of the for stem. Just take note of that. We'll also notice this kind of bowel effect right here, right, versus this curvature effect over here. So again, the program we saw in the other letter forms, we are seeing it here. There's also a fun move of reduction of weight here and then gaining of it over here. So again, array model has really been thought. There's a lot of thinking about reduction of weight and making typographic color a main priority of this project. I could see that by these strategies. Yeah, and again, like notice again this whole form structure of the three compared to this structure. Again, you can tell they're pulling from different historical sources. Array much more old style, calligraphic and thinking, versus a slab serif, a more modulated, drawn principle of letter forms. And again, also the same principles again of priority of stroke weights. Again, take notice of the emphasis of these elements versus the thinness right here, right, which is mirrored in this 9, for example. So notice again, there's almost like a sans serif principle going on in this Vulf mono where all contrasts are not treated equally. Sometimes you can allow for things to stay relatively close in weight, while when there's joints involved, it force reduction of weight to occur for the sake of unified typographic color. So we can see that so far. I suspect we'll be seeing that in the text settings as well. And lastly, note, by the way, again, if you look at the 5, notice the kind of curvature proportions is kind of more regularity and consistency of position, right, versus a strong sloping energy in the 5, for example. So again, calligraphic thinking versus a more drawn slab serif principle. Oh, this fun one. Okay, give me a second. Gotta go to. Oh, there you are. Okay. All right. So sorry about that, gang. All right, so here we are. We have our settings. So let's see what our interpretations are for it. So one is, again, this was their weights were adjusted to match similar X heights. Array mono is a lighter weight typeface in general. The regular weight is lighter compared to Vulf mono. We can see that very quickly. What you should be noticing is one is the relationship of the capitals to the lowercase. Right. I actually, we're looking at these two. I do believe it looks like Vulf mono did I think a more successful job harmonizing the capitals to the lowercase. The best way to put this, they feel like lowercase letters. So compared to the, uppercase, they feel like uppercase letters compared to the lowercase. They're not just kind of enlarged lowercase letters, which is actually a very tough challenge. I bring that up, for example, again, in the most challenging of letter forms, like the M, for example, the cap M is a really tough challenge to deal. And in a lot of ways, with mono, it seems to be a little more successful in owning that space with more comfort of the two. Let's contrast that to, like, for example, the O, for example. Right, I believe the proportions of this Vulf mono O is a little more comfortable in its spacing and like in its relative squatness to wideness compared to array mono. I would say probably that it looks like clearly Vulf mono is wider. I think probably one of the strategies James Edmondson of OHno type chose was that, instead of economy of space, I'm just going to let my set width be kind of a very wide set width by default. That way these forms won't be kind of just like smashed up and impossible to work with. That might have been the strategy James chose to try to solve these problems, while array chose to get efficiency of space a little more higher priority, and the sacrifice was the uppercase being a little more uncomfortable in its position. We do see the contrast play, kind of the flickering effect you should be noticing, kind of the interplay of contrast, right? In the O, for example, there should be kind of a flicker. Actually, I could have also done as a comparison within the OHno type library. I think it's called Corvigan, Corvic or something. I think it's called. It's a sans serif with a kind of forced contrast model like this in array mono. So I actually could have done that as well as a comparison. So it has a very similar property to that, I would say. Just now, this is the monolinear serif edition of it versus sans serif mode or edition of it. Yeah, and actually, there's some other strategies actually that were not obvious on the large setting that I'm starting to see now in the small setting. If you notice, actually, it looks like the D in this case in Vulf mono does not actually there's a shift down in the bowl that not go up to the X height, probably to save space. Let's see if that was done in array, if I can find it. Doesn't appear so. Now, not as much, not to the point of obviousness I can see in Vulf mono. So that's a very particular point worth noting. So that's like there was a shift down on that bowl, that D, to compensate for the flag serif being placed on top. That's a very interesting point. Yes, and yeah, so as we can see here, the reductions of weights, right? For example, in the A, for example, we saw are generally not that, again, it's achieving this kind of typographic color that's trying its best to be similar in weight. But of course, naturally with monospace, there's going to be compromises and issues. Like, for example, grid, notice again that G is just not going to play well compared to other letters next to it because of how it has to fit the space effectively. There's an interesting move of the addition of that bowl terminal, right? Kind of the ear and the bowl terminal ear of the G versus in Vulf mono. Because remember, the one of the things we were observing was the choice of bowl terminal in the A of Vulf mono versus the lack of it in the G, and the inversion of that in array mono. Yes, I mean, I'm looking at this, and I would say probably I think actually array mono actually did a pretty good job at it. You know why? Because I feel like if it just had the non-bowl terminal edition, it wouldn't fit the space as effectively. I feel like actually in some cases it looks like the Vulf mono edition, it seems to be fading out a little bit because of the lack of a bowl terminal over there. I'm looking for another G to verify. It's not the worst. It's not really that bad. It's not really the worst issue to have. Because you don't want I imagine the decision was not to let the G overpower too much compared to the other letters. Although that's not always the case. So, for example, the T, was not evaluated, right, is actually taking an incredible amount of space. It must, right, because of the way it's drawn. It does appear that the approach chosen in array mono was more successful at that. It seems a little less heavy-handed in its approach. That X does feel slightly heavy in the array mono, so I am going to look at the approach taken in Vulf to verify that. Yes, it does appear like the array mono X weights could have been handled a little bit more effectively at specifically looks like the bottom quadrant, towards the baseline position, to even out the weights. So I see that flickering up a little bit. But overall, there should be, both to give it kind of actually it's interesting because, for example, there's a kind of a roundness effect in both monos I can see across the board, mainly because how wide the O is and these kind of flare outs that were done across the typeface. We can see that really strongly applied. In that case, well, there's a kind of much more sharpness. There's actually a crispness in array mono because of this introduction of contrast, the way it was done. So Vulf mono is a little more like kind of rounder and bubblier, while array mono is a little more crisper and sharper in its approach, probably because of the introduction of the contrast and the way it was in that specific way it was drawn, the kind of football shapes and the counters of the rounds, for example. So that's already very interesting. Let alone the just general typographic weight difference of the two, right? Array mono is lighter, Vulf is heavier. All right, so what we can see overall is, and as we can see here, actually in the slide, my intuition before that looks like even though they're both monospace, monospace is not necessarily mean all equal in all cases. Their handling of contrast was different. There were differences in their weights. How weight was distributed was different between the two. The strategies of the serifs, the strategy of the stems were different. The strategies of including of weight were treated differently. How the capitals related to lowercase were different. There's a lot of variation here. And actually, the most basic of it all was the basic set width. They are different. Both mono is given a more economy of space than array mono. So this has effects on the typographic decisions. So fundamentally, when you're designing a monospace font, one of the first questions that has to be asked is, what is your set width? And it should take in consideration all these problems that were discussed in this episode. So I think there's a lot of possibilities in monospace. I think it's an area worth investigations, and I'm glad to see a lot of other type designers introduce type 8 projects that explore those ideas. So this has been Thomas Solo and Fontribute. I hope this episode was helpful for you and you learned something new about monospace fonts. Please be in touch if there's any particular topics that you would like me to talk about. There was a discussion about Crimson coming out as a Google font with a new Crimson Pro edition that had differences compared to the two. And someone talked to me about this on YouTube, and I'm going to do that next as an episode. So I take feedback from the audience very seriously. So if you have anything you'd like me to talk about more, I'm more than happy to do so. And I want to thank you so much for sticking around for this. Must have been at least half an hour, if not more, lecture. So thank you for that, and have a great week. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.